going? It's been a little bit since I've done a video tutorial, so I just kind of wanted to go through this most recent asset that I've created and just kind of walk through the code and explain how some of it works so you guys can get an idea of what it is that I'm working on. So let me go ahead and just run it real quick to show you what we did. So the whole point of this asset was to create a RTS style drag and select cursor. So if we look up any sort of like RTS game, usually you're controlling a bunch of units, and in order to select them, you kind of just click and drag, and you create like a selection highlight box over it, and it selects those units. So I wanted to do that same type of thing in GameMaker, and as you can see here, I'm able to kind of click and drag and create this box, and over the units that I select, it activates them. So right now I only have the red units as units that can be selected by this box. But with the code that I have set up, it's really easy to just turn these on and off. So you have full customization over the units that you're able to highlight. So if we wanted to, we could select everything, or we could select, in this case, just the red ones. So I'm going to kind of go through real quick how I did everything and just walk you through all of it. So as you can see, I have quite a few scripts here, but these are just super, some of these aren't really like super complex. So you'll see like draw rectangle color alpha is just our draw rectangle color script that is built into GameMaker, but I wanted to be able to call this script with an alpha value. So all I'm doing is I'm just feeding in, again, the same type of arguments that we would feed into our draw rectangle color, but I'm just setting the alpha before to our set alpha, and then I'm resetting it back to the default value of 1 after it. So this, you don't even really need this script. You could just copy these 3 lines of code into your code that you're using, but you'll notice that when I come into my selection tool, which is the main object in this scene, right? So actually I'll create a group. We'll just call this other, and we'll just kind of throw all of these things into our other group, because those are just part of the game to showcase. Really the main thing that you're taking out of this asset is this selection tool object. So you'll notice that in my draw, I have this draw selection box. Okay, so let's go to draw selection box, and that is just drawing a rectangle color alpha, and then we have all of our values set here, right? And as I mentioned before, drawing rectangle color alpha and draw line color alpha are just the default draw color, line color, and draw rectangle color built-in functions, but with our predefined alpha value being set before and resetting alpha afterwards. So again, that way we have control over the alpha channel on these draw functions, which we normally don't have. So these are pretty straightforward, nothing too exciting there. And you'll notice that again, the draw selection box is this script, but it just has one call in it. The selection box is really straightforward. You can see, I just have this spaced out for formatting, but again, this is just draw rectangle. So here we have an x1, a y1, an x2, a y2, a color value 1, color 2, color 3, color 4, an alpha value, and whether or not we want an outline. Since the box isn't changing colors at all, we don't really have to worry about, there's only one value getting into it. And I'm going to go ahead and run the project again so we can take a look at it. But you'll see that that box is that center point, and then those white lines around the edges, those are the lines. So the selection tool consists of 2 things. It consists of the rectangle in the middle and then the border. And in this case, the border is this white line, and the selection box is kind of that vague, like slightly opaque color in the middle. So here you'll see that we can actually change some of the things. And I'm going to go over how all of this works in a second, but I just kind of want to demonstrate some of the different things that we can do. So here we could change the color to like red, and let's change the box color to green, right? So if we go ahead and run this again, and here you can see I can change the alpha values here, but I just left them the same. Here you can see that now we're drawing this tool with a red border and a green box. And again, I can modify these alpha values, right now I think I have the border being drawn to a full 1, or what is it, 75%? Yeah. And then I have the box, or that middle rectangle, the green part here, being drawn only to 30%. So you can customize those to depending on like how visible or see-through you want those. Like you could turn the box off completely and just have a line, or you can make them more opaque or more invisible depending on what it is that you're looking for in your project. So okay, so that's pretty much how you modify the values. You'll see that here again, so I have draw selection box, which is just this, and then I have draw selection box border, which is just drawing our 4 lines around it, okay? So again, nothing super complex, it's just I split these up into a bunch of scripts just to make it a little bit easier to organize. Okay, so let's walk through how this works. So that's kind of how you modify stuff. Yeah, so here you can see draw line color, draw rectangle color alpha, draw selection box border, and then draw selection box border dashed. The box border dash is, I'm kind of going to briefly show you this. I'm not going to explain this. You can kind of see that there's a bunch of stuff going on here. This is how we draw the dashed line. Let's go ahead. I'm going to go and turn dashed on, and we'll set the number of subdivisions to 50. And there's 2 different modes that the dashed has. You can have a fixed number of subdivision, or you can have a fixed subdivision size. And it depends on what you want for an aesthetic, but here you can see that I have just a fixed number of subdivisions, and those subdivisions get larger and smaller as we stretch the box out. Maybe I'll describe how I did the dashed line in another video, but it just kind of is going to take a while. And if you really want to take a look at this code, you can pause the video and take a look at it now, or you can download the asset and kind of look through it and try to understand it a little bit more. It's not super complex, it's just a little tedious to go through. Okay, so let's, just for the sake of this video, let's turn these back off. And here, lastly, I'll show that we have our objects to select. So these are the objects that we can select with the tool. So as I mentioned before, right now, the only thing that we can highlight is our red object or our enemy object, and the player object is unselectable. But if I just comment that out, take out those comments and set it to active again, when I run the program, I can actually just highlight now everything. So you'll see that everything that's in this selection tool gets highlighted. Green, red, doesn't matter. Whatever is inside that range is going to get selected. So, okay, cool. So how does it work? Well, it's actually really simple. It's 2 things. It's a start position and it's an end position. And that's really what you see right here. We have a start X, a start Y, a current X, and a current Y. Now you could do these as like a pair or an array, essentially creating like a tuple value in GameMaker. But since GameMaker doesn't really handle tuples super well, I just split them up into 2 different variables each. So start X, start Y, and then our current X and our current Y. Okay, so here we kind of set it all up, and this doesn't really matter, but you'll see that in this step, what we do is we're constantly tracking our current X and our current Y to be to our mouse X and our mouse Y. Okay, that's pretty straightforward, right? When I run it, we want it to constantly track where the mouse is so that we get this dynamic stretching, okay? So pretty straightforward. Here, what we need to do is, we're gonna come back to this in a second. Let me zoom in, that way you guys can see this probably a little bit better. I forget to zoom in always, so I apologize, guys. I'll try to remember to do that at the beginning of each video. Okay, so we set current X, we set current Y. Every frame of our step event, we're constantly updating that variable. It doesn't matter if we're clicking or not, we're just updating this variable. It's low cost, so we don't really care about turning this on and off. Here you can see that when we click, we activate our start X and our start. So when we press the mouse button down, we want to store where we started our drag selection, right? So here when I click, okay, I've clicked down, and now I've stored that value of start X and start Y, and we have current X and current Y always being tracked. So now all we have to do is just draw a box and a border from our current X, which is right up here, our current XY, our start xy, which is up here in this corner, and then wherever our current xy is. So that's it. We just click, we store that value, and then we just draw our selection box from the start position to the current position, okay? So that's pretty straightforward, and that's what this is. So this is setting our start x and our start y is going to be our mouse xy when we click, so check button pressed. And then when we see that we're not holding onto the mouse button anymore, we want to clear that out. You might be able to do this with a mouse check button released. Yeah, I think this would work if you do a mouse check button released, but I just did a not, like the mouse button is just not being active anymore. So I think you could do this with like a else if mouse check button released. You could probably do this and maybe get the same effects, but I'm not sure. So either way, this works. Go ahead and give that a try if you'd like to. Either way, you're going to get the same result in the end. Okay, so when we let go of the mouse button, we want to wipe those values. We don't want to store them anymore. And the reason we do this is because we need to only draw our rectangle when we have values stored. So you'll notice in our draw event, we check if start x is not equal to none and start y not equal to none. That means we've clicked and we've stored our values. So in that situation, then we want to start drawing. And what we can do is we can just wipe those when we let go. So then we'll know, okay, don't draw because we don't have any values stored. Okay, so this is great. So we store our start value and we clear it. We have our current value. I will get to this in a second. This is just like storing our instances in the selection that get selected. See, get all instances in selection box and store them in a list. Okay, so we'll come back to this. Let's just comment this out. Okay, so let's just draw the rectangle first, right? So we store our current, we get our start position. Now we come up into our draw event, we check, okay, if start x is not equal to none and start y is not equal to none, then let's draw our selection box, okay? And again, I'm going to comment this out just to kind of split this up into segments that we're looking at. So draw selection box. Well, we actually saw this code a little bit earlier. This is just a draw rectangle alpha value script that we defined, which again, remember is basically almost exactly the same as draw a rectangle. Oh my gosh, sorry. Okay, that's basically the exact same as this script, but we wanted to add an alpha channel into it. And so that means that this is going to be our start, or this is going to be x1, y1, x2, y2, color, alpha, and if we want a border. Now I set border to false because I wanted to be able to customize my border, and that's what I do with this draw selection box border. If we had it set to true, it would just kind of default to what GameMaker defaults it to, but I wanted some control over it. So I set it to false because we're going to create our own border onto it, okay? So, and then all we do for drawing our rectangle is x1 is going to be start x, y1 is going to be start y, x2 is going to be current x, y2 is going to be current y. And since current x and current y are always updating, this is always going to constantly be updating. So this will draw in real time a rectangle that is following our mouse. So I commented out a lot of stuff, but if we run it, we'll see that we can still click, drag, highlight our box. So here we go. So we just have our box. Now you'll notice that none of the units are getting selected, and that's because I commented out this code right here that selects them. But we still are actively drawing our box to follow our coordinate positions. And that is just with a couple lines of code. All we're doing is we're just setting our start and our current, and then we're just drawing a box to those positions. That's really as straightforward as it gets, right? And then the same thing, we want to draw our line. Now I have a function in here, a check in here, to see if we need to draw our dashed border. that function in that method script that we created earlier. But I could take all of this. Essentially, we just want to draw our selection box border. And again, if we look at this, we're just drawing, oops, I cannot zoom when I go full screen. Let me put it back up. Okay, so here we're just drawing a top line. So start x, start y, current x, start y. And then our right line, current x, start y, right? So we just kind of connect the points around the box. And that's pretty much it, right? We're just drawing 4 lines around the box based off of our current x, y, and our start x, y grid positions. Or sorry, our world positions. It's not really a grid. Okay, so that's it. So that's drawing. That's how we draw it, right? So if I run it again, we'll see that our border is drawn and our box is drawn. And as mentioned in the beginning, you can just modify your values on how opaque they are, what colors they are, if they're dashed, if they're solid lines, right? We can change all of these things just in our create. And that's just because our draw rectangle color alpha and our draw line color alpha value scripts that we created here are just pulling these values always. So if these change, then these will change and we'll get a different value drawn to the screen. Okay, so lastly, just going over how we select the units, okay? And that's gonna be this right here. So we only want to select once we've let go of the mouse. And that's why we use this mouse check button released, okay? So this is gonna check as soon as we let go of the mouse. Let's get everything in that selection and store it into a list. So here you see that we clear the list first, right? Because we don't want anything in the list. We want to clear everything from the list, fill the new objects into that list, and then do whatever we're going to do with those things in that list. So in this case, so we say do whatever with objects in current selection, right? I spelled that wrong, but whatever. Okay, so in this case, all we're doing is we're just setting those objects equal to active, and then the objects just draw differently depending on whether they're active or not, right? And this is kind of where you would put your own code into it. You could do anything. You could set them to active, and then once they're active, you could have player code that is checking to see what to do next. I'm going to leave that up to you. It's kind of this open box for you to fill in however you would like. But for this situation, all I'm doing is just drawing some different values so that we can see whether or not they're selected. Okay, so let's take a look at this first one, the first important one, which is fill objects selected list, okay? So as mentioned before, in our create, we actually have this object selected, which is a DS list that we've created, okay? So this objects to select are the objects that we're allowed to select, but the object selected list is the list of currently active units that we have selected. So these are what we can select. This is what we have selected, okay? Just to make that distinction. You could rename those if that's confusing. So all we do is we're going to iterate through our list. Let's take a look at this inside first, okay? So this collision rectangle list is a built-in script to GameMaker. It used to exist as a let me pull up a Safari. Okay, what is it called? Collision rectangle list. Okay. Okay, so this used to exist as a yo-yo scripts, a yo-yo games like scripts. I'm sure you've probably seen that website before, but if not, it doesn't really matter. It's now adopted into GameMaker Studio. So so we have collision rectangle, right? That's pretty standard. We define a rectangle, and then we get the instance ID of the object in that rectangle. But what we want to do is we want to get all of the IDs in that list. We want to get multiple of them, okay? So this is the one that I was talking about, the gmlscripts.com. So we can actually come and take a look, collision rectangle list. Okay, so returns a list data structure. So this is what we're going to get back. We're going to get a list populated with the IDs of instances colliding within a given rectangle. Okay, so we define a rectangle, and this script will give us everything that exists inside that rectangle. Now, this is the GML scripts version. The GameMaker version actually has a couple other parameters, such as sorting, right? If we want to sort the list, okay? So that's what we're doing here. We're going to say collision rectangle list, and we want to define that list, okay? Or that rectangle. So we set an x1, we set an y1, x2, and a y2, right? This is pretty standard. This is what we've been doing in drawing our rectangle, and this is what we're going to do in setting our collision rectangle, okay? So our collision rectangle is just going to be the same size as our drawn selection rectangle, okay? And then what we do is we need to set the object that we're looking for, okay? Well, what we could do is I could just say O player, okay? And this is going to select all the instances of our object player, our player object, and store it into a list, okay? And then we set false precision checking. We don't want to worry about colliding with ourselves. This should never be an instance, but I always just set it true just in case. And then the list that we want to store the IDs into, okay? So remember, this is going to return a list, but what it does is it actually just allows us to say, hey, just store that list data structure into this variable, which, as we mentioned before, is this object selected list. We say oSelectionTool.object selected. And then we don't want to order. We don't really care about ordering, so we set it to false. Okay, so if I were to run this, this would actively select all instances of the player object and store that into our list. Okay, so we can see, oh yeah, green is the player, right? So green is selected, but red is not selected. Okay, and this is weird because we set oEnemy, which is our red object. Oops, I'm just hitting random buttons all over the place. So why are we not selecting our enemy object, right? Well, that's because we need to use this for loop up here that I kind of skipped, okay? So what we can do is we can iterate through all of the objects in our objects to select array, this one right here. And what we want to do is we're going to just get that object. Okay, see, this is an object, this is an object. We look here and we can see, okay, oPlayer is an object, oEnemy is an object. That's why it's highlighting red, because it's an asset in our project. So what we can do is we can just iterate through everything in that array, and then we can set the object that we want to select as that current iteration. So it'll check, is that object an oPlayer? It'll say, oh yes it is. Okay, it'll store that in our list. And then it'll iterate through it again, and it'll say, okay, look for every instance of oEnemy, and it'll be okay, and then it'll store that in the list. Now we are adding extra iterations, right? This is a for loop, and as this list gets longer, this processing time is going to get slower. So just keep that in mind and kind of be careful. Maybe there's a better way to do it with like a DS map or some sort of mapping where we can set up like a connection between objects. I'm sure there's probably a more efficient, faster way to do this. But this shouldn't be a problem because it's not happening every frame. It happens only when you release the mouse. And as long as this game isn't scaling up really large, you shouldn't have issues. So for getting started, this is kind of a good place to start with. Okay, so that's how we fill the list. I hope this makes sense. If not, read through some of the documentation or read through some of my commenting on here. It might make more sense. Okay, so lastly, what we do is we just clear out that list first. So you'll see that clear objects. All we do is we go through that list. We set everything in it active to false. And this is essentially just undoing whatever we have done here. So in set selected objects to active, this is that action that we're performing on all the objects. And all that's doing is it's just iterating through the list, setting its active to true. That's all that this is doing, okay? So when we clear out that list of selected objects that we have selected, we need to undo what we've done. Now, depending on your game logic for when you implement it, it might be different. But in this situation, all I'm doing is I'm just going to say, hey, set everything in that list to active to false first, and then let's just clear that list. Let's just wipe it clear, because we don't want to, we want to reset the selection every time we click and drag. Okay, so that's all that this is doing here. We iterate through all of our objects selected. We say a with statement with that object that we've selected, and then we set its active to false, and then we clear the list. Okay, so that's it. I know it was kind of a lot, kind of fast. If you have any questions, feel free to message me, download the code, take a look at it. If you liked this, please consider supporting me on itch.io by downloading the asset. I think I have it at $2 right now. You always can just follow this code for free. It's why I make these YouTube channels, to hopefully help educate you a little bit better and to understand how to do it yourself. But if you still feel like you're struggling and quite can't understand it, download the code, play with it, make some changes, and see how it starts to affect it. This is, I would say, is a relatively beginner to intermediate level project. I would say it's on the upper end of beginner and on the lower end of intermediate. So if you feel like that's where you're at, then this is going to be a great project for you to work on. But if this is still kind of confusing to you, I would say maybe go back and review some foundational stuff before coming back to this project, because this is just one small piece of a larger game, right? Like an RTS game is really complex. You'll notice that the board that I used is just is basically just the board from my isometric board game framework asset that I released last, and that code is probably about 10 times more complex as this, and that's kind of going to be like the next step. I mean, it really just depends on the project, so make sure you have a really strong foundation of this before you go on to the next step, and if you don't understand this, maybe take a few steps back to understand the code and some previous topics. But yeah, I think that's pretty much it. All I have is just the room and just these objects dropped in here. So if you download this project and you have it, all you need to do is just drop this O selection tool into your project somewhere and make sure you have all these scripts, and make sure that this is in the room that you're using it in, and then it should work out fine. All right, I'm gonna cut this video now before it goes any longer than it needs to be. This was supposed to be a pretty short, just kind of straightforward video. I plan to do some more tutorial stuff soon. I know I've just been kind of doing asset walkthroughs, which can be helpful, but it's not as detailed as a traditional tutorial is. So I actually have a couple tutorials planned soon. I'm just really busy with my job and some contract work that I'm doing, so I'm gonna just try to fit it in when I can. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Leave any comments or questions or concerns down below. Feel free to shoot me a message on Twitter. Yeah, I think that's pretty much it. All right, guys, thanks for stopping by, and I will see you in the next video.